I've never told anyone why I stopped camping. Not my family, not my friends, no one. Partly because I don't think they would believe me, but mostly because reliving those memories sends chills down my spine even now, years later. But I have to tell someone. The weight of this secret has been crushing me, and I think this is the best place to share my experience. So here goes. My name is Alex, and I used to love the outdoors. Well, that's not entirely true. Growing up, I was never what you'd call an outside kid. My childhood was spent indoors, lost in the glow of video game screens and YouTube videos. The great outdoors held little appeal for me back then. It wasn't until my late 20s that I began to develop an interest in nature and spending time outside. Don't get me wrong, I'd been on camping trips with friends when I was younger, but those were more about hanging out and goofing off than truly appreciating nature. It wasn't until I hit my late 20s that I discovered the profound peace that comes from being alone in the wilderness. There's something indescribably comforting about it, even though the idea of being miles from civilization with no one around is admittedly eerie. I know it might sound strange, but being out there in the middle of nowhere became my escape. It gave me time away from the pressures of my home life and work, allowing me to focus on myself and my well-being. The solitude cleared my mind in a way nothing else could. I'm not sure I can adequately explain it to someone who hasn't experienced it themselves. Maybe I'm just talking nonsense. But I'm not writing this to wax poetic about my love for camping. No. I'm sharing this story because of what happened on my last camping trip. An experience that shook me to my core and made me swear off solo camping forever. Usually, when I went camping, I stayed on or near family-owned land. It was comforting to have some familiarity with the area. But about 2 years ago, I had a falling out with a family member who owned the property I typically used. I won't get into the details, but suffice it to say, I was no longer welcome there. Desperate for my wilderness fix, I resorted to driving for hours into the back roads of West Virginia, looking for remote spots to camp for the weekend. Yes, I know it was technically trespassing, but come on, I was an hour's drive from any main roads with no houses for miles around. Who was I really bothering? I know, it was a stupid and potentially dangerous thing to do. But I was desperate to get away, to find that peace I craved. And after a couple of years of doing this, I had yet to encounter another soul out there. I was always careful to leave no trace behind, packing out everything I brought in. I even avoided foraging or hunting, bringing all the supplies I needed so I wouldn't take anything from the land. This routine worked well for me until about 1.5 years ago. That's when everything changed. The trip started like any other. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where you can smell winter on the horizon. I pulled off the highway at a random exit, then just kept driving deeper into the wilderness. The further I went, the more relaxed I felt, watching the signs of civilization slowly fade away in my rearview mirror. About 1.5 hours in, around 7:34 a.m. according to my dashboard clock, I turned onto a narrow dirt road. As I bumped along the uneven track, I passed a dilapidated old shed that looked like it might collapse at any moment. A little further on, I saw an abandoned van with no wheels, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I chuckled at the eerie sight, feeling like I was in the opening scene of a horror movie. If only I had known. Another 2 hours of careful driving brought me to a small clearing just off the road. It was the perfect spot to conceal my Jeep. Not that anyone was likely to drive by anyway. I parked, then spent the next half hour meticulously packing my oversized backpack with everything I'd need for the next few days. With one last glance at my vehicle, I shouldered my heavy pack and started hiking deeper into the woods. A thick fog had settled in the valley, giving everything a dreamlike quality. As I walked, I made a mental map of my surroundings and stacked small stones at regular intervals to mark my path back to the Jeep. It was a habit I'd developed over the years. You can never be too careful in unfamiliar territory. The forest was alive with sound as I hiked. Branches creaked and groaned in the light breeze. Unseen animals rustled through the underbrush. A chorus of birdsong echoed through the trees. To the uninitiated, these noises might have been unnerving, but to me, they were a soothing symphony of nature. I know plenty of people who would have been jumping at shadows, letting their imagination run wild with every snapping twig or distant animal call. My extended family back in West Virginia is full of folks who believe wholeheartedly in cryptids and the paranormal. But me? I was a skeptic through and through. I didn't believe in Bigfoot, ghosts, or any of that nonsense. To me, the sounds of the forest were simply an invitation to stay and enjoy the natural peace. As I continued my trek, I noticed something odd. The echoes of my footsteps seemed slightly off, as if there were a second set of feet following just behind mine. When I stopped, the phantom steps would continue for a split second before falling silent. I knew it was just an acoustic trick caused by the fog and the terrain, but I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder every now and then. Of course, there was never anything there. I have to admit, part of me enjoyed the slight uneasiness. That prickly feeling on the back of your neck, the sense of being watched. Knowing logically that there's nothing there, but still entertaining that lizard brain instinct that something is lurking just out of sight, beyond the fog. It added a delicious spice of excitement to the trek. About 15 minutes into my hike, I came across something that gave me pause. It was a massive tree, easily the largest I'd seen in the area. But what caught my attention wasn't its size, it was the state of its bark. Large sections had been scraped clean off the trunk, as if something had been trying to claw its way inside the tree, or through it. As I got closer, I noticed there was a distinct pattern to the marks. They weren't random or chaotic like you might expect from, say, a bear sharpening its claws. No, these scratches were evenly spaced, occurring every 3 feet or so up the trunk. The pattern continued for a good 15 feet before stopping abruptly. The cuts were deep, too. I'm honestly not sure how the tree was still alive given the extent of the damage. I ran my fingers over the gouges, feeling the rough edges where bark had been torn away. A shiver ran down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Rationally, I knew there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was damage from other falling trees during storms. Or perhaps some kind of animal behavior I wasn't familiar with. After all, this tree was absolutely massive. I could have stood with my arms outstretched and still not reached around its circumference. Who knows how long it had been standing here, or what might have caused those marks over the years. Still, as I continued on my way, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling those scratches had given me. Little did I know, it was just the first of many unsettling experiences I would have on this trip. It was about 12:53 p.m. when I finally found what I was looking for, a perfect clearing nestled between the ancient trees. The space was just large enough for my tent, with room for a campfire and a convenient fallen log that would serve as a seat. I couldn't have asked for a better spot. I set to work immediately, wanting to get my camp established before nightfall. I pitched my tent under the protective branches of a towering oak, its leaves just beginning to turn gold with the changing season. Next, I cleared a space for my fire pit, carefully lining it with stones I gathered from the surrounding area. As I worked, I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just trees swaying gently in the breeze, and shadows shifting as the sun moved across the sky. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination, fueled by the isolation and the lingering unease from the marked tree I'd seen earlier. By late afternoon, I had everything set up to my satisfaction. My tent stood ready, my sleeping bag unrolled inside. The fire pit was prepared, just waiting for me to strike a match. I had even managed to drag the fallen log into a comfortable position near the fire pit, creating a cozy seating area. As the day wore on, the temperature began to drop noticeably. The warm autumn sun was losing its battle against the chill in the air. I decided it was time to get a fire going, both for warmth and to cook my dinner. I had just got the flames crackling merrily when a sudden thud made me jump. Something had hit the top of my tent with enough force to make the whole structure shudder. Heart pounding, I spun around, searching for the source of the noise. That's when the smell hit me. A horrific, rotting stench filled the campsite, so strong it made my eyes water. Gagging, I circled my tent, trying to find whatever had fallen on it. The smell grew stronger as I rounded the far side, and then I saw it. There, lying in the fallen leaves, was a snake. Or at least part of a snake. It was a big one, nearly as thick as my wrist, but it had been mutilated. The head was completely gone, and what remained of the body looked partially eaten. The wounds were fresh. I could see that whatever had killed this snake had done so very recently. For a moment I just stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. Then my brain kicked into gear, searching for a rational explanation. "Damn birds," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my racing heart. It wasn't the first time I'd seen evidence of aerial predators dropping their prey. When I was a kid, a hawk had nearly hit me with a rabbit it had caught. And just a few years back, I'd found a dead mouse on my windshield one morning. But even as I tried to convince myself it was just a normal occurrence, something felt off. The size of the snake, the way it had been torn apart, the fact that it had been dropped directly onto my tent, it all seemed a little too coincidental. The stench was becoming unbearable. Holding my breath, I grabbed my small collapsible shovel and scooped up the gruesome remains. I carried it a good distance from my campsite before digging a hole and burying it. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every rustle of leaves made me flinch. By the time I finished and made my way back to the campsite, the fog had started to clear, but the forest didn't grow any brighter. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples that barely penetrated the dense canopy above. As I approached my tent, I heard it again, footsteps, or something moving in the brush nearby. I froze, straining my ears to pinpoint the source of the sound. But as soon as I stopped moving, the noises ceased. The forest fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint crackling of my campfire. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, hardly daring to breathe. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and there, to hike back to my Jeep and get the hell out of these woods. But the rational part of my brain insisted I was overreacting. It was probably just an animal, curious about the human intruder in its territory. Besides, I told myself, hiking through unfamiliar woods at night was far more dangerous than staying put. So, against my better judgment, I decided to stay. It was getting late anyway, and I was exhausted from the day's hike and setting up camp. I told myself a good night's sleep would reset my nerves, and things would seem less ominous in the morning light. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up securely behind me. As I settled into my sleeping bag, I glanced up at the roof of the tent, illuminated by the flickering firelight outside. A wet streak glistened across the fabric, residue from the snake's impromptu landing, I assumed. I made a mental note to clean it in the morning. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, shivering despite my warm sleeping bag. Every sound from the forest outside seemed magnified. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches in the wind. Each noise sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my body, leaving me wide-eyed and alert. I must have dozed off eventually because I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was a strange rhythmic noise, tapping, clicking, knocking. I couldn't quite place it. It was too quiet and distant to make out clearly, but distinctive enough to have pulled me from my fitful sleep. I lay there for a few moments, barely breathing, trying to hear it again. But all I could make out was the faint whisper of the wind and the dying crackle of my fire. As much as I wanted to just roll over and go back to sleep, my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering glow over the campsite. A chilly breeze hit my face, carrying with it the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. I squinted into the darkness beyond the dying firelight, straining my eyes and ears. Nothing. The strange sound, whatever it had been, had either stopped or was too faint to hear over the rustling of leaves and the creaking of the larger trees as they swayed in the wind. I waited for a few more minutes, but the forest remained stubbornly quiet. Shaking my head at my own jumpiness, I zipped the tent back up and burrowed into my sleeping bag. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me, I told myself. Too many late-night horror movies and creepypasta stories rattling around in my brain. I forced myself to take deep, calming breaths and eventually drifted back into an uneasy sleep. When I woke the next morning, weak sunlight was filtering through the walls of my tent. For a moment I lay there, disoriented. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. The marked tree, the mutilated snake, the strange noises in the night. In the clear light of day, it all seemed a bit silly. I had let my imagination run wild, turning ordinary forest sounds into something sinister. Determined to shake off the lingering unease, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The campsite looked peaceful in the early light, no sign of any disturbances from the night before. Birds were singing in the trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was hard to believe I had been so spooked just a few hours earlier. I set about my morning routine, stretching out the kinks from a night spent on the hard ground, then getting a small fire going to heat water for coffee and oatmeal. As I waited for my breakfast to cook, I cleaned the streak off the roof of my tent, a task that was far less unsettling in the daylight. After eating and cleaning up, I decided to go for a hike. I needed to work out the stiffness in my muscles, and I figured some exercise would help clear my head of any remaining jitters from the night before. I packed a small day pack with water, some snacks, and my first aid kit, then set off into the woods. The forest was beautiful in the morning light. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, illuminating patches of forest floor in a golden glow. Mist still clung to the lower areas, giving everything a dreamy, ethereal quality. I found myself relaxing as I walked, my senses filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of the wilderness. About 45 minutes into my hike, I came across a creek. On one side, the land rose sharply into a steep cliff face, easily 30 to 35 feet tall. On the other side, the relatively flat woodland I had been hiking through continued. I decided to follow the creek for a while, enjoying the soothing sound of running water. I had been walking along the creek for maybe 10 minutes when something caught my eye. About 100 yards downstream, a dark figure was crouched at the water's edge. At first glance, I thought it was a bear. It was roughly the right size and shape, and bears weren't uncommon in this part of West Virginia. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The way it was positioned seemed off, not quite natural, and it was incredibly still. Most animals would have noticed my presence by now and reacted in some way. I stopped walking and squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure remained motionless, seeming to blend into the shadows cast by the cliff face. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly became very aware of how alone I was out here. Remembering the bear spray in my pack, I slowly reached for it, never taking my eyes off the figure. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it must be audible. With the spray in hand, I mustered my courage and shouted as loudly as I could, hoping to scare off whatever it was. My voice echoed through the trees, startlingly loud in the quiet forest. But the figure didn't move. It didn't run away. It didn't even flinch. It just stayed there, perfectly still. I waited for what felt like an eternity, barely breathing. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to turn. The movement was unnatural, more like a machine pivoting than a living creature. As it turned, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness, punctuated by 2 pinpricks of light that I realized with horror were eyes. Before I could process what I was seeing, it moved. One moment it was by the creek, and the next it was simply gone. Vanished into the forest with a speed that no natural animal could match. I stood there, frozen in place, for several long moments. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I was more sleep-deprived than I realized. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I turned and began making my way back upstream, towards my campsite. I tried to move quietly, but my heart was hammering so hard I was sure it must be audible for miles. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I had gone perhaps halfway back when I heard it, a splash from behind me. I spun around, expecting... I don't know what I was expecting. But there was nothing there, just the quietly burbling creek and the looming cliff face. I picked up my pace, no longer caring about stealth. I just wanted to get back to my tent, pack up my things, and get the hell out of these woods. Another 10 minutes of brisk walking brought me to a particularly narrow part of the creek. The cliff face here was practically vertical, rising straight up from the water's edge. As I was navigating this tricky section, carefully placing my feet on the slippery rocks, I heard it again. A splash, closer this time, and then another sound, a scraping noise like something dragging itself over rock. I froze, torn between the desire to run and the fear of slipping and injuring myself. Slowly, I turned my head to look back the way I had come. At first, I saw nothing, but then a movement caught my eye. A rock about the size of my fist tumbled down the cliff face. It bounced once, twice, then landed with a splash in the creek barely 15 feet from where I stood. My eyes darted up the cliff face, straining to see what had dislodged the rock. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A dark shape, blacker than the shadows around it, moving with that same unnatural mechanical precision I had seen before. But when I blinked, it was gone. That was enough for me. Caution forgotten, I scrambled across the remaining rocks and bolted into the woods. I ran as fast as I dared through the undergrowth, heedless of the branches whipping at my face and arms. All I could think about was getting back to my campsite, to the relative safety of open ground and my supplies. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes or so, I burst into the clearing where I had set up camp. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. As the rush of adrenaline began to subside, I became aware of just how quiet it was. The birdsong that had filled the air this morning was gone. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Still panting, I straightened up and looked around the campsite. Everything was as I had left it. My tent still stood. My gear was untouched. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a palpable sense of wrongness in the air. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was letting my imagination run wild again. I needed to calm down, think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation for what I had seen. Maybe it was some kind of local wildlife I wasn't familiar with. Or maybe I was more exhausted than I realized, and my mind was playing tricks on me. To distract myself, I decided to build up the fire again. The physical activity would help me calm down, and the warmth and light would be comforting. I gathered some wood from the pile I had collected yesterday and set about arranging it in the fire pit. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few moments I would glance up, scanning the tree line, but there was never anything there, just shadows and leaves rustling in the faint breeze. Once I had a good fire going, I sat down on the log I had dragged over yesterday. The flames were hypnotic, and I found myself staring into them, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The scratched tree, the mutilated snake, the figure by the creek. It all seemed too bizarre to be real, and yet I couldn't deny what I had seen. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. As beautiful as it was, I couldn't appreciate it. All I could think about was how quickly night would fall and how vulnerable I would be in the darkness. A gust of wind blew through the campsite, causing the fire to flicker and dance, and with it came a smell that made my stomach turn. It was the same rotting stench from yesterday, when the snake had landed on my tent, but this time it was stronger, more putrid. My heart racing, I jumped to my feet and spun around, trying to locate the source of the smell. And there it was, in the exact same spot as before. The snake. The same snake I had buried yesterday, now lying on the ground as if it had never been moved. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the log. This couldn't be happening. I had buried that snake. I had dug the hole myself, covered it with dirt and leaves. There was no way it could be back unless something had dug it up. Something had gone to where I buried it, unearthed the rotting corpse and brought it back here. To my tent, to me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever I had seen out there in the woods, whatever had been following me, it wasn't just some animal. It was intelligent. It was toying with me. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the mutilated snake. The stench was overwhelming, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I try to make it back to my car? But that would mean hiking through the woods in the dark with that thing out there. Should I stay put and hope it would leave me alone? But what if it didn't? As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, a sound broke through my panicked thoughts. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it grew louder, clearer, a rhythmic tapping, like something hard striking wood. It was coming from the trees directly in front of me, beyond the circle of firelight. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was maddeningly regular, mechanical almost, like a metronome, or the ticking of some grotesque clock. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to flee, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fire, straining to see what was making that sound. Tap, 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 and then, between one heartbeat and the next, I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of eyes glowing in the darkness like hot coals. They were arranged in no pattern I could discern, scattered seemingly at random throughout the trees. Some were high up near the tops of the trees. Others were closer to the ground. But all of them were focused on me. Tap, tap, tap. The sound continued unabated. But now I could see its source. With each tap, one pair of eyes would blink out of existence, only to reappear a moment later in a different spot. It was as if whatever these things were, they were moving through the trees with impossible speed, vanishing and reappearing at will. tap, tap, tap. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, watching this nightmarish display. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of this impossible, terrifying sight. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The tapping ceased. The eyes blinked out one by one until only a single pair remained. They were larger than the others and seemed to glow with an inner light that was both beautiful and terrible to behold. For a long moment, those eyes held mine. I felt as if they were looking into my very soul, weighing and measuring me. And then I heard it. A voice, if you could call it that. It wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave," it said. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say I understood it to mean leave. The concept filled my mind, pushed out all other thoughts. I didn't need to be told twice. Breaking free from my paralysis, I turned and ran. I didn't bother with my tent or my gear. I didn't stop to grab my backpack or my car keys. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were on fire. I ran until I could no longer hear the sounds of the forest around me, until the trees gave way to scrubland, and finally to the familiar sight of my Jeep parked on the side of the dirt road. By some miracle, I had left the car unlocked and the keys in the glove box, a habit born from years of camping in remote areas where theft wasn't a concern. I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbled the keys into the ignition, and peeled out onto the road, spraying gravel in my wake. I drove for hours, not daring to stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by the comforting lights of other cars and the distant glow of towns and cities. Only then did I pull over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. As the adrenaline faded, I found myself wondering if it had all been real. Had I really seen those impossible eyes in the darkness? Had I imagined that unearthly voice telling me to leave? It all seemed so fantastical in the harsh light of day. But then I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. My face was scratched and dirty, leaves and twigs tangled in my hair. And my eyes, there was a wild look in them that I had never seen before. The look of someone who had gazed into the unknown and come back forever changed. I never went back for my gear. Whatever was out there in those woods could keep it. I drove home and tried to forget about the whole experience. I told myself it was just stress, lack of sleep, and overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There are things out there in the dark places of the world. Things that defy explanation, that shouldn't exist but do. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you might catch a glimpse of them. But if you do, take my advice. Run. Run, and don't look back. I haven't been camping since that day. I can't bring myself to sleep outdoors, to be alone in the wilderness. Even walks in the local park make me nervous now. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for those terrifying eyes. I thought I had put it all behind me. But now, as I sit here typing this out, I'm filled with a growing sense of dread. You see, my childhood friend just invited me to go camping with him on a property his family owns. It's in the middle of nowhere, he says, perfect for getting away from it all. I don't know what possessed me to agree. Maybe some part of me wants to face my fears, to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But as we turn down a dirt road, passing a rotting shed and an abandoned van without wheels, I can't shake the feeling that I've made a terrible mistake. The forest looms ahead of us, dark and forbidding. And as we drive deeper into the wilderness, I swear I can hear something. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from the woods. Tap, tap, tap. In 1972, a plane carrying 45 passengers crashed in the midst of the towering snow-covered Andes Mountains. A group of passengers miraculously survived, but now faced the most challenging task: surviving in the harsh conditions of this unforgiving place. The cold was biting and conditions were severe. There was no sign of life in this place, far from all elements of civilization. Food sources were non-existent, and the little food that was on board the plane quickly ran out. Here the survivors faced the most difficult decision of their lives, having to eat the bodies of their deceased companions in order to stay alive. The circumstances these passengers went through were harder than anything imaginable, yet they continued to fight and cling to survival. Would they eventually survive, or would this be their final journey? Our story begins in October 1972. The protagonists are a rugby team from Uruguay. Rugby is a sport somewhat similar to American football. Most of the team members were university students in their early 20s. Uruguay, for those unfamiliar, is one of the countries in South America. The team had been invited to play a match in Chile, also a South American country. The trip was supposed to be short, just 4 days. They planned to leave on Thursday and return on Monday. The team chartered an affordable plane, given that they were young and didn't have much money. It was a medium-sized aircraft that could seat about 50 people, with the number 571. After the team sent a passenger list to the pilot, he informed them there was room for 10 additional people. So some team members decided to bring family along. In the end, the total number of passengers reached 45, including the flight crew. Among the passengers was a young man named Nando Parado, one of the team members. It's important to remember this person as he will play a major role in the story. We can even consider him the main character. When Nando learned there were extra seats on the plane, he decided to bring his mother and sister along. He imagined taking them on an enjoyable trip, touring Chile and visiting markets. It was like a gift he was giving them with all his love. He had no idea that what awaited them would be worse than anything he could imagine. Their journey began on Thursday, October 12, 1972. They departed from Montevideo, Uruguay, heading to Santiago, Chile. They had to fly over Argentina and the Andes mountain range, towering mountains stretching long distances, considered the highest in South America. But due to bad weather that day, the pilot decided to land in Mendoza, Argentina, located just before the Andes. They spent that night in Argentina and resumed their journey on the morning of Friday, October 13th. In Western culture, Friday the 13th is considered an unlucky day. The pilot and team members weren't thinking about this at the time, but what would happen that day would indeed be the worst thing they could imagine. The plane they were on was a Fairchild FH-227, considered one of the worst in terms of design. Its engines were weak relative to its weight, making it prone to accidents. The passengers were unaware of this information. If they had known, they likely wouldn't have chosen to fly on it. During the flight, the plane had to cross over the Andes Mountains. This posed a significant risk, especially with the bad weather and weak engines. The pilot planned to circle around the southern end of the Andes range and cross through a low pass, avoiding flying at high altitudes. The mood on the plane was cheerful and lively. Passengers were playing games and singing, unaware of the danger ahead. In a pivotal moment, Nando traded seats with a friend, a decision that would later determine who would survive and who would perish. The plane reached the southern end of the Andes, and the pilot turned west towards the city of Curicó. But here, a fatal error occurred. The pilot reported to air traffic control in Santiago that they were over Curicó, when in fact they were still over the Andes Mountains. This mistake in determining their position would lead to disaster. The pilot thought they had passed the mountains and began descending. but visibility was poor due to clouds and storms surrounding the Andes peaks. Suddenly, the pilot and passengers found themselves face to face with a towering mountain. The pilot desperately tried to pull the plane up, but the weak engines couldn't provide enough power to climb at the required speed. The plane struck the mountain, and in an instant, the tail and wings were torn off. Most of the fuselage disappeared, leaving only the front section. In that horrifying moment, several passengers were ejected with the disintegrating parts, especially those seated in the rear of the plane. The front section continued sliding down the snowy slope, with the remaining passengers inside clinging to life. The following moments were chaotic and terrifying, with seats flying loose and passengers' bodies colliding. Despite the catastrophic crash, there was an element of luck. The pilot's final attempt to pass through a curve in the mountain saved the front of the plane, and its relatively smooth slide down the snow saved many lives. In the end, out of the 45 passengers, 33 survived the initial impact, but many were seriously injured. In the first hours after the crash, the survivors tried to comprehend the tragic situation they found themselves in. They were at an altitude of about 3,600 meters above sea level, in an environment none of them were accustomed to. Snow and storms surrounded them on all sides, and the biting cold penetrated to their bones. The less injured survivors tried to help those more severely hurt. The scene was tragic: scattered bodies, unconscious individuals, others suffering from fractures and serious injuries. Nando, who was still unconscious, was placed near the plane's exit, exposed to the severe cold. Here, something strange and amazing happened. Nando had suffered internal bleeding in his brain, and according to medical experts, his exposure to extremely low temperatures may have helped save his life. The intense cold helped limit brain swelling and reduce bleeding. This was like an unintended miracle. After 3 days, Nando began regaining consciousness. He was in a state of confusion, trying to understand what had happened. His friends, not considering his fragile health condition, bombarded him with the bad news all at once: the plane crash, his mother's death, and his sister's severe injuries. Despite the shock, Nando quickly grasped the situation. He asked about his sister and tried to comfort her when he learned of her location. He felt immense guilt for bringing her on this ill-fated journey. His sister was only 17 years old. After regaining his balance, Nando left the plane wreckage to see the surroundings. He was shocked by what he saw: nothing but mountain peaks and endless snow in every direction. There was no sign of life. Not even animals existed in this harsh environment. The survivors hoped rescue teams would reach them soon. Indeed, 3 countries were participating in the search operations: Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. But the problem was that the search area was vast, and weather conditions were extremely difficult. Additionally, the plane was white and had crashed on white snow, making it nearly impossible to spot from the air. The survivors heard the sounds of search planes flying overhead, and even glimpsed some from afar. But despite their attempts to attract attention, no one could see them. They held their breath and stood on edge, waiting for any news of their rescue. As days passed without being found, some began to lose hope. The idea that they had survived the initial crash seemed impossible, let alone surviving for several days in these harsh conditions. But the survivors themselves didn't lose hope, and remained convinced they would be rescued. However, their situation was worsening day by day. Nando tried to stay by his sister's side and comfort her, but her injuries were too severe. On the 5th or 6th day, his sister passed away, reducing the number of survivors to 27. As more days passed, the survivors gradually lost hope, reaching the peak of despair on the 10th day. An important development occurred. The survivors had a small radio, and thanks to one person's expertise in electronics, they managed to create a makeshift antenna. This allowed them to pick up some radio stations and follow news about the search for them. But what they heard was shocking. Authorities announced that search operations had been halted and they couldn't be found. This news shattered the last glimmer of hope for the survivors. At the same time, hunger had begun to gnaw at their bodies severely. They had consumed all the food from the plane days ago. For water, they managed to solve this problem by using metal sheets from the plane to melt snow under the sun. But the food problem was more complex. They tried to eat anything edible, including leather from luggage and plastic, but these desperate attempts were not enough. And here the idea they all feared began to emerge, eating the bodies of their deceased companions. The idea was horrifying and terrifying for everyone. Most of them completely rejected the idea at first, while some reluctantly accepted it. It was clear there was no other way to survive, either starve to death or eat the dead. There was no third option. Some refused the idea for religious reasons, while others couldn't accept the idea of eating human flesh, especially that of their friends. It was impossible for a normal person living in normal conditions to imagine themselves in this situation. But these survivors were on the brink of death, and their ability to endure and way of thinking had completely changed. In the end, they made the difficult decision. Due to the freezing cold, the bodies were well preserved, not decomposing. They needed tools to cut the meat, so they used pieces of glass from the plane's windows to make makeshift knives. They would take small pieces each time, not making large meals. Sometimes they would cook the meat, but due to the scarcity of wood and combustible materials, they rarely managed to light a fire. Most of the time they ate the meat raw. They all ate while disgusted with themselves. But when this meat entered their bodies and began to break down into proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, they felt energy returning to their bodies, even if only slightly. In these moments, their minds realized this was the only way to survive, no matter how disgusted they were by it. To cope better with this situation, they made an agreement among themselves. Anyone who died would allow the others to eat their body. They took photos of themselves with a camera found in the plane wreckage, and in some of these photos, parts of their companions' bodies can be seen. As days passed, they began to get used to this situation. It became part of their daily life in this place, their only source of food. They continued like this, clinging to any hope of survival, with no specific goal other than staying alive. But the difficulties didn't stop there. There was another danger awaiting them, one they were unaware of. The Andes Mountains, due to their towering height and the massive amounts of snow that fall on them, were prone to frequent avalanches. The tragedy was that the place where the plane wreckage had settled was like a valley surrounded by mountains on all sides, making it vulnerable to any avalanche that might come from above. Around the 15th day, the weather began to worsen, and large amounts of snow started falling on the area where they were. The survivors remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage, and even built a wall-like structure using luggage and belongings to cover the opening of the fuselage. Heavy snowfall continued for about 3 days, and as the snow accumulated, the likelihood of avalanches increased. On the night of the 18th day, while the survivors were inside the plane's fuselage, they suddenly heard a sound like an explosion, as if it were a massive thunderclap. Immediately after, they felt a vibration in the ground, as if 1,000 horses were galloping towards them. In an instant, an avalanche hit the plane's fuselage, burying everyone under massive amounts of snow. The situation turned to chaos in a moment. Some were completely buried under the snow to the point where they could no longer move at all. This is one of the worst ways a person can die, being buried alive under snow in this deadly cold, unable to move or even breathe. Others were partially buried but could move a little. Those who could move began trying to dig themselves out. Some suffered serious injuries due to the force of the avalanche that violently struck them and threw them inside the plane's fuselage. Those who could move began trying to help the buried and injured and get them out. The situation was extremely difficult. The biggest problem was that even those who managed to get out from under the snow found no safe shelter around them. The world around them was all snow, and there was no place to take refuge or feel warmth. The entire plane fuselage was buried under the snow. The survivors remained trapped inside the fuselage for 3 days. They were all buried under the snow, but inside the fuselage. The fuselage was the only thing protecting them. Outside, snowstorms were raging, and they could hear the sound above their heads from under the snow. Strangely, the avalanche turned from a curse into a blessing, as it formed a barrier protecting them from the massive storms outside. They remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage, and their only source of warmth was 1 or 2 small lighters. But the situation remained tragic. The avalanche caused the death of 8 of them, reducing the number of survivors from 27 to just 19 people. However, the death of these 8 was in itself a kind of tragic blessing. It provided the rest with an additional food source to live on, while at the same time reducing the consumption of the limited food sources they had. It's terrifying to talk about death in this way, but this was the reality they were living in. After 3 days under the snow, they finally managed to get out. The plane's fuselage was almost buried under the snow, but they slowly began removing the snow with their hands and cleaning the inside of the fuselage. The fuselage was like a home or shelter for them, the only place they could take refuge. As days continued to pass, the survivors began thinking of ways to get out of this predicament. Some might wonder why they didn't try to explore or move from their location. In fact, they did try. They were particularly looking for the plane's tail, believing it might contain supplies or things that could help them. But these attempts always ended in failure. They couldn't move far from the plane's fuselage. The main reason was the depth of the snow. When they walked on the snow, their legs would sink into it, making walking extremely difficult. Additionally, the weather conditions were highly unpredictable. Suddenly, fierce snowstorms could hit, and without proper clothes or equipment to protect them, advancing in any direction was extremely difficult and dangerous. Even their eyes were affected. They had nothing to protect their eyes from the intense glare of the snow, making visibility difficult. All their initial attempts to explore the surrounding areas were unsuccessful. They would cover short distances and then return to the fuselage. The survivors realized they needed a solution to the problem of walking on snow. And in situations like this, when survival is the primary goal, humans begin to invent tools to help them. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. After deep thinking, they came up with the idea of using the foam from the plane seats along with belts to create something like snowshoes. These innovative shoes proved effective in walking on snow. They reached this invention after about a month from the beginning of their ordeal. During this month, many of them began to see Nando as the leader. He was the one among them with the strongest desire to survive, and he was always trying to motivate them and push them to continue. Incidentally, Nando was the oldest among them, so those younger than him began to see him as a leader, and he took on this role seriously and began to act as the group's leader. One day, after trying the snowshoes and feeling they would enable them to move longer distances, Nando and 2 of his companions, Roberto and Antonio, decided to start a new exploratory journey. They chose a day when the weather was relatively clear and the sun was shining, and they began to move. Their plan was to try to move away from the plane for as long as possible and return on the same day. It was like an experiment. They kept walking as they descended into the valley, and after climbing a hill, they saw the plane's tail from afar. The tail had flown to this location after the plane crash. They immediately headed towards the tail to explore it from the inside. They found some bags inside and began searching for any food they could find. But all they found was a small chocolate bar. At least it was a good change from the food they had become accustomed to. Among the things they also found was a camera. This camera is the one they used to take the photos that documented their survival journey in these mountains. They also found 24-volt batteries that were installed in the plane's tail. Here an idea occurred to them. They remembered that at the beginning, they had tried to use the plane's radio to communicate with any possible entity. They thought that maybe the battery in the radio was faulty, and that they might be able to use these new batteries to operate the plane's radio again. Nando and his companions covered a greater distance than they had planned, and they felt that time was running late. So they decided to return to their friends who were waiting for them at the plane's head the next morning. After returning with the battery, the survivors began trying to connect it to the plane's radio. There was a person named Roy Harley who had some experience with radio devices. He wasn't a specialist, but due to his basic knowledge of these matters, they appointed him as their radio expert. But the matter was very complicated, especially since they had no real knowledge of these things. There were hundreds of wires and connections everywhere. How could they connect these wires to the battery and make the radio work? It was almost impossible without real technical knowledge. Unfortunately, despite their great efforts and numerous attempts with the radio, they failed to make it work. This failure crushed their morale and made them feel more desperate. Nando, although he was also disappointed, tried to instill some hope in his companions. He would tell them, "As long as we are alive, we must not despair and must continue trying to find a way to survive." Nando was also the one who came up with the idea of using the camera to document their survival journey with photos. He would tell them, "Even if we don't survive, maybe after a few years or even 100 years, someone might find the plane wreckage and these photos, and they'll know that we stayed alive and tried." Almost 2 months had passed since the day of the crash. Among the 19 remaining people, several were injured. Some had been injured since the moment of the initial crash, and their pain was increasing with each passing day. Survival was becoming harder and harder for them. During this month, 3 more of them died, reducing the number of survivors from 19 to 16 people. Out of the 45 who were on the plane, only 16 remained. Most of the bodies of the dead had been eaten by the living, and only a few bodies remained. Among these remaining bodies were those of Nando's mother and sister. Nando being still alive, no one wanted to touch the bodies of his mother and sister. He decided to leave them until the last moment. Nando would always tell his close friend Roberto that they needed to get out of this place. How long would they remain standing in the same spot? All directions around them were frightening, as if they were in the middle of a vast ocean with no knowledge of its beginning or end. The plane's fuselage was like a small boat protecting them from this ocean, so the idea of leaving this boat was scary. This is what prevented them from moving from their place. They were afraid that any attempt to move away from this place would mean certain death. But after more than 2 months without any new sign of hope, the only option became to move from their place. Of course, everyone was afraid of this. It was like throwing oneself into the ocean literally, as they didn't know their exact location. The only idea they had was that they were currently on the western side of the Andes Mountains. They remembered that before the co-pilot died, he had told them they had passed the city of Curacao, which is on the western side in Chile. So they believed they were in this area. But in reality, they were closer to the eastern side. They had been thinking all along that if they moved from this spot, they should head west, because it was closer to civilization and cities, although in reality the east was closer. On the western side, there was a high mountain in front of them, while in the east there was a valley. Going down to the valley would have been easier than climbing the mountain. But they thought that if they headed east, they would face higher and more difficult mountains, because they thought the east was far from them, while the west was close. This is what they believed because they didn't know their real location. In reality, if they had headed east, they would have found a hotel about 20 kilometers from their location, and there were no high or towering mountains between them and the hotel. The only thing that could have hindered them was a river, and this river would indeed have been difficult to cross. But if they had reached the river near the hotel, they would most likely have been able to call for help from people on the other bank. Heading east was probably the best option for them. The path was still difficult and long, but if they had known all this information, this would undoubtedly have been their best choice. But because they believed they were on the western side, they were always convinced that if they moved from this spot, they should head west because this was their best option. Nando was insistent on getting out of this place at any cost, but the rest of the group were procrastinating due to their fear and hesitation. Whenever Nando tried to convince them, their response was that the time wasn't right, or the weather wasn't suitable, or that they needed to wait a little longer. It was clear that fear had taken hold of them. Nando realized he couldn't leave alone, so he kept trying to convince them, or at least convince some of them to go with him. Most of them encouraged the idea of embarking on this journey, but they weren't ready to go with him. Each of them would say, "Yes, I agree with you. Someone needs to go out and try to bring help, but I can't, brother." They supported the idea, but no one volunteered to take the risk with him. Even his close friend Roberto was hesitant at first. This was his closest friend, and the one who had gone with him when they found the plane's tail. But after Nando's insistence, Roberto finally agreed. The third person Nando convinced to go with them was Antonio. He was also the third person who had been with them when they found the plane's tail, and he was the most physically fit among them, so he was the natural choice for this journey. So the same three who had gone out and found the plane's tail were now going to set out on a journey in search of new hope. This journey would be a journey of no return. Either they would reach safety or die trying. Therefore, they had to make all their preparations. And the rest of the group, despite their fear and hesitation, helped in preparing for the journey and provided all possible support. First, they allocated a larger share of food to the three, a share that could last them for several days, even though food was already scarce. Second, they needed a way to protect themselves from the cold at night, as it was impossible to survive amidst these mountains without something to protect them. Here, one member of the group, named Carlos, collected heat-insulating materials from inside the plane's fuselage and sewed them together using electrical wires to create something like a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was large enough for the three of them and was very durable. Several of them took turns sewing it, and the sewing process itself took a few days. After preparing all the necessary items and tools, the trio, Nando, Roberto, and Antonio, bid farewell to their friends and set out on their difficult journey on December 12, 1972. The last thing Nando said to his friends who remained at the plane was that if they ran out of food and needed to use the bodies of his mother and sister, he gave them permission to do so. After that, the three headed west, and directly in front of them was a large mountain. They believed this mountain was the biggest obstacle in front of them, and they thought that once they reached its summit, they would be able to see the green valleys and cities or villages on the Chilean side. They realized that climbing this mountain alone would require at least a full day. They began climbing the mountain, and it was an extremely tiring and exhausting process. Climbing on this steep slope was very difficult, especially since they had no previous experience or practice in mountain climbing. At these altitudes, even breathing was difficult due to the lack of oxygen in the air. The more they moved and exerted effort, the more oxygen they needed. But due to the lack of oxygen, breathing became harder and harder. With every step they took, they faced the risk of slipping. They tried to hold on to themselves, but couldn't. With every step they climbed, they would slide half a step. They then tried to climb the rocky parts, which required tremendous strength and high fitness. Rocks would sometimes fall on them. Perhaps the only thing that helped them was that they had lost a large amount of their weight. Each of them had lost about 30 or 40 kilograms. Finally, after all the effort they had exerted, they reached what they thought was the summit. But the peak in front of them was what is called a false summit. This is a peak that appears from below to be the mountain summit, but when you reach it, you discover it's a false summit, and that there's a higher peak in front of you, and that you have to climb more to reach it. This crushed their morale when they reached this false summit. But at least this place was suitable for spending the night. They slept huddled together and used the sleeping bag their friends had made for them. The cold was very harsh, but at least the sleeping bag enabled them to survive. The next day, the three continued their arduous climbing journey. Their friends who had remained at the plane's fuselage could still see them climbing. They saw them as small dots from afar, but they were still within their field of vision. After the three climbed further up the mountain, Roberto noticed something from afar that looked like a street or road, but it was on the eastern side, the opposite side to them. He pointed it out to his friends and asked if that looked like a road. Nando said he couldn't see any road, and Antonio said he wasn't sure. But Roberto insisted that it was a road, and even began arguing with Nando, saying it would be better to go down the mountain and head towards this road on the eastern side. But Nando firmly rejected this suggestion and told them, "We've climbed all this distance, so why should we go back down?" In fact, what Roberto saw was indeed a road used by people, but it was on the eastern side. They could have reached it if they had headed east, but now it had become far from them. Until this moment, they had believed they were closer to the western side, so they made the decision to continue their journey westward and continue climbing the mountain. The climb was extremely exhausting and took much longer than they had expected. They thought they would need 1 day to reach the summit, but it took them 3 days. The hope that drove them to continue climbing to the summit was that they would see the green valleys and villages or cities on the western side. This had always been their hope, that when they reached the summit, they would see these things. But the big shock came when they actually reached the summit. What they saw was snow-covered mountains extending as far as the eye could see. There were no fields, no green valleys, no cities, no villages, no signs of life at all. The amount of despair they felt at that moment is indescribable. After all this effort and all this hardship, the result was nothing. Nando, despite feeling all the emotions of despair at that moment, turned to his friend Roberto and said, "Let's continue, and whatever happens, happens. Either we reach safety or we die trying." Roberto, although he was at the peak of despair at that moment, when he saw Nando speaking this way, felt energy returning to him again and said, "By God, you're right, my friend. We've come this far, so let's continue. And whatever happens, happens. Either we live together or we die together." But being three was slowing down their movements, and in addition, their provisions and food had decreased significantly. So Nando turned to their third friend, Antonio, and said to him, "Antonio, you go back and give us what's left of your provisions and food, and return to the plane. Roberto and I will continue alone." Antonio agreed to this, gave them what was left of his provisions, and went back down the mountain. Of course, going down was 1,000 times easier and faster. It probably only took a few hours. When Antonio came down from the mountain, his friends who were at the plane saw him and went to him. He told them that they had seen nothing but mountains extending as far as the eye could see, and told them that Nando and Roberto had taken the rest of the provisions he had and decided to continue the journey on their own, and that nothing would stop them except death. Nando and Roberto continued walking westward. They came down from the mountain they were on top of, but from the other side. Under the mountain, there was a single path extending between the mountains, so they decided to follow this path. The mountains surrounding them were towering, but luckily this time, they didn't have to climb any of these mountains. They were trying to follow the paths and valleys between these mountains. Of course, they sometimes had to climb some hills or small peaks, but they didn't have to climb a high mountain like the first one. Due to the size of the mountains surrounding them and the vastness of the place they were in, it was difficult for them to sense distance. They had no sense of the distance they had covered or would cover. And perhaps this was a blessing in itself, because if they had known how to calculate the distance, they might have felt despair. But all that occupied their thoughts at that time was just moving forward, and this certainly helped them psychologically. This arduous journey of theirs between the mountains continued for 10 days from the time they left their friends at the plain. But finally, after these 10 days, they reached the line that was for them the lifeline, the line where the snow ended and life began. This moment was like a new life for them. The joy and happiness they felt cannot be described. They began walking in the green valleys they had been dreaming of 10 days ago. Finally, they felt they had really returned to life. And even on their way, they saw a cow. So they began to tell themselves that there must be people somewhere near them. They were still in the midst of wilderness and nature, and hadn't seen people yet, but they felt they were getting close. They began to see trees, grass, flowers, and even water. Nando and Roberto say that in those moments, they felt as if they had entered a 5-star hotel. The weather was beautiful, there was water, and they even had grass to eat. They felt that these simple things, which we see in our daily lives in an ordinary way, were the greatest thing in the world. During these 10 days, Nando and Roberto had covered more than 60 kilometers to reach the place they were now. But even after reaching these green valleys, they spent one more night in the open. The next morning they continued their journey and reached a river. And here was the surprise. There was a man riding a horse on the opposite bank. They began shouting at him and gesturing to him. Communication between them was difficult because the river separating them was quite large, and the sound of the rushing water was loud, so they couldn't hear each other. Of course, the man on the horse was surprised in turn at how these people had reached the top of these mountains, because they were still considered to be in the mountains, even though they had descended quite a distance. Of course, Nando and Roberto had no option to cross the river by swimming, because the river's current would have swept them away due to its strength. So the man on the other bank had an idea. He took a piece of paper and a pen, tied them to a stone, and threw them to the other bank towards Nando and Roberto. Nando took the paper and pen and immediately began writing a message explaining their situation. This is a real image of the letter Nando wrote. He wrote, "We come from a plane that fell in the mountains. We are from Uruguay. We have been walking for 10 days, and at the plane's fuselage there are still 14 injured people waiting for rescue. We have no food or provisions and need help as soon as possible. Please help us. We can't even walk anymore." Nando threw the letter to the man on the other bank, and signs of shock were clear on the man's face as he read what was written in it. After reading it carefully 2 or 3 times, he signaled to Nando that he understood the situation, and indicated to them to stay where they were and that he would bring them help. Before he left, the man took a piece of bread and cheese and threw them towards Nando and Roberto. This bread and cheese were the first food other than human flesh they had tasted in the past 2 months. The man on the horse took many hours before he could bring help, because the place where they were was still far from civilization and cities. The man's journey alone took about 10 hours. But finally this man returned with a number of soldiers and military personnel who were able to rescue Nando and Roberto. These shots you see before you are real footage of the moment of their rescue and when they were found for the first time. Their condition was miserable, of course, and the signs of fatigue and suffering they had endured were evident on them. These shots and images were taken by journalists as soon as the news reached them. The journalists came with the military, as if they had suddenly appeared out of nowhere on top of the mountains. In this picture we see Roberto on the right and Nando on the left, and in the middle the man who was on the horse and who can be considered their savior, whose name was Sergio Catalan. Imagine that the journalists didn't even give them time to breathe. They immediately began conducting interviews with them. One of the journalists even asked them, "How did you survive all this time? What were you eating?" Roberto was about to answer, but Nando intervened and told the journalist that they wouldn't answer this question. The journalists, frankly, were not behaving appropriately at all. These 2 men had just come out of hell, literally. They should have been left to rest a little, and they should have moved to rescue the rest of the survivors at the plane. The soldiers and security authorities tried to find out the location of their friends from Nando and Roberto. They brought them a map to try to determine their location. Nando was familiar with the location because he had remained focused on the directions they had walked, as he knew he had to remember the location so they could return to rescue the others later. Nando pointed to them, the location where he thought the plane was. They told him that this location was on the Argentine side, on the eastern side of the mountains, and that it was impossible for them to have walked all this distance. Nando told them, "By God, I don't know if we're in Argentina or not, but I'm almost certain that this is the location of the plane." Of course, the distance that Nando and Roberto had walked was about 60 kilometers. The authorities and police were unable to comprehend how 2 people in such a weak and emaciated state could have covered all this distance, so they were skeptical about the location. But Nando kept insisting that this was the location. Their friends who had remained at the plane had been waiting anxiously for the past 10 days. Some had even lost hope and thought that Nando and Roberto had died on the way. But at the same time, they were following the news on the radio. You can't imagine their joy when they heard on the radio the news that Nando and Roberto, 2 survivors from Flight 571, had been found. Their happiness was indescribable. They knew that finally they would be rescued. I ask you by God to imagine their feelings at that moment. I'm sure it was the most beautiful feeling they had experienced in their entire lives. It was as if they were born again. They began hugging each other, and all the joy in the world couldn't contain their happiness. The authorities and police called for helicopters to begin the rescue operation. Once again, the helicopter pilots asked Nando about the location, and he pointed to the same spot on the map. But the pilot said to him, "Look, it will be difficult for me to find them on my own. I need you to come with me." And although Nando was certainly tired at that moment, he said to him, "Okay, I'll come." So Nando boarded one of the helicopters and began flying with them as they tried to trace the path he had come from. The weather was good that day, but despite this, flying at these high altitudes was difficult for the helicopters. The aircraft was shaking frighteningly. Thank God that they didn't have an accident and fall among the mountains again. Imagine the tragedy if that had happened. But finally, the helicopters passed over the high mountain that was in front of them. This was the same first mountain that Nando and Roberto had climbed. Nando kept pointing downwards and saying that the plane's fuselage was below them. But the fuselage was white and everything around was white with snow, so it was almost impossible to see. Even when the aircraft got close to the location, they couldn't see the fuselage, and here we understand why the previous search attempts for them had failed. Although there were planes flying in the areas above them, seeing them was almost impossible. Even Nando and the helicopter pilots couldn't see the plane's fuselage and the rest of the survivors until they descended to a very close altitude to them. If Nando hadn't known the place and the terrain in this specific spot, it would have been impossible to find them. The helicopters landed at the site of the plane wreckage, and finally they saw the rest of the group below waving to them, flying with joy. This is a real image taken from a camera on board the helicopter at the moment they finally found them. And here we also see real video footage of the plane wreckage. All of Nando's 14 friends who were left at the wreckage were rescued. I'm sure none of them will forget that day, which was December 22, 1972, the day of rescue. And glory be to God, for the number of days they spent from the day of the plane crash until they were rescued is the same as the number of the year they were in, 72 days from the moment of the crash. The remaining 14 survivors, along with Nando, were brought to safety. Their condition was, of course, very poor. Each of them had lost between 30 to 40 kilograms of their weight, but joy was evident on their faces. And after that, their names were announced on the radio so that their families would know who had survived. Of course, shortly after, they met with their families and were reunited again. News of this story spread and was covered by media around the world. It became a global story. But afterwards, many articles appeared in newspapers talking about the subject of their survival by eating the bodies of their friends. This particular aspect spread, and perhaps was one of the reasons that made people attracted to this story. When one hears that they survived by eating their friends, they are shocked. Some of these articles even began to speak against them and call them cannibals. There was a great debate about this issue, and discussions began among people about whether if we were in their place, would we do the same as they did or not. In the end, if they hadn't eaten their friends, it would have been impossible for them to survive. This story is one of the most famous survival stories that spread around the world. Books were written about it and documentaries were filmed, and it received huge media attention. Nando and his friends appeared in many interviews and forums and told their story in all its details. This was one of the biggest stories that was circulated in the media because of its power and strangeness, and perhaps also because of its somewhat happy ending. The 16 survivors continued to meet over the years. They would hold a gathering every year on the same date they were rescued, December 22nd. And by the way, all the talk we said about Nando, especially that he was the undisputed leader of the journey, all this talk was by the testimony of his friends. It wasn't him who talked about himself and said, "I was the leader and I saved them and I did." They all knew that the greatest credit after God in their survival was to Nando and his insistence until the last moment on survival, no matter what the circumstances. Nando, who at the beginning of the crash was considered dead and remained unconscious for 3 days due to the brain injury he suffered, and whose survival from it was something miraculous in itself, still communicates and meets with Roberto and Sergio, the horsemen who found them after they came down from the Andes Mountains. Their relationship with him remains strong, and they are still friends to this day. At the end of the story, it's impossible for one of us to comprehend the conditions these people lived through amidst these mountains. We won't know their feelings and their psychological, mental, and physical state they were in unless we were actually in their place. And finally, I conclude with a question for you. If you were in their place, do you think you would have been able to do what they did? Would you have been able to eat the flesh of your friends? And here we have reached the end of the story. Whoever hasn't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and click on the bell button. And there are also other amazing stories you can listen to. It was the kind of summer that seemed to stretch on forever, the days blending into one another in a haze of golden sunlight and endless possibilities. I'm Alex, by the way, and this is the story of how my best friend Mona and I stumbled upon something that would change our lives forever. Willowbrook, our sleepy little town, wasn't exactly known for its excitement. Most days, the most thrilling thing that happened was old Mrs. Jenkins' cat escaping and leading the neighborhood kids on a merry chase through backyards and alleyways. But that summer, the summer before our senior year at Willowbrook High, everything changed. It started innocently enough. Mona and I had fallen into a comfortable routine of meeting up almost daily for bike rides. Living on opposite sides of town, it was the perfect excuse to catch up and explore the familiar streets that suddenly seemed full of new possibilities now that school was out. Mona wasn't just my best friend. She was my partner in crime, my confidant, and the yang to my yin. Where I was cautious, she was daring. When I wanted to play it safe, she pushed us to take risks. It was a dynamic that had served us well throughout our friendship, leading to countless adventures and only a handful of disasters, like the Great Treehouse incident of 2021, but that's a story for another time. On this particular day, July 15th to be exact, we met up at our usual spot, the old oak tree at the corner of Maple and Elm. The sun was already high in the sky, promising another scorcher of a day. Ready for another thrilling adventure in the wild suburbs of Willowbrook? Mona called out as I pedaled up, her grin infectious as always. I laughed, feeling the weight of the summer heat already pressing down on me. Oh yeah, I can hardly contain my excitement. What's on the agenda today? Watching paint dry at the hardware store? Mona's eyes sparkled with mischief. Actually, I was thinking we could spice things up a bit. How about we explore that old abandoned house on Sycamore Street? I felt a twinge of apprehension. The house she was referring to had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, its windows boarded up and its overgrown yard a jungle of weeds and forgotten dreams. Local legend had it that the place was haunted, though no one could ever agree on the specifics of the ghostly inhabitants. I don't know, Mona, I hesitated. That place gives me the creeps even in broad daylight. She rolled her eyes dramatically. Come on, Alex. Where's your sense of adventure? We've been riding around in circles all summer. Don't you want something exciting to happen? Little did I know then how much I would come to regret those words in the days to come. Fine, I conceded, unable to resist her enthusiasm. But if we get arrested for trespassing, I'm blaming you. With a whoop of victory, Mona set off down the street, her long dark hair streaming behind her like a banner of rebellion. I followed, my heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As we rode, the familiar sights of Willowbrook flew by, the quaint storefronts of Main Street, the sprawling park where we'd spent countless summer days as kids, and finally, the looming presence of Willowbrook High School. Even from a distance, its red brick walls and imposing clock tower dominated the landscape. Hey, Alex, Mona called over her shoulder as we passed the school. Have you heard about the renovation plans? I shook my head, swerving to avoid a pothole. What renovation plans? She slowed her pace slightly, allowing me to catch up. Apparently, they're going to start some major construction work next month. Something about updating the science labs and adding a new wing. Huh? I mused, glancing back at the school. Maybe they'll finally fix that weird echoing problem in the gym. Mona laughed. Or exorcise whatever ghost keeps slamming locker doors when no one's around. I shuddered, remembering the countless times we'd all jumped at unexpected noises echoing through the halls. Don't even joke about that. This town's got enough creepy stories without adding school ghosts to the mix. As we continued on towards Sycamore Street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about today. The air felt charged somehow, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath in anticipation of something. Little did I know that our little detour to the abandoned house was just the beginning. The real adventure, the one that would test our friendship, our sanity, and our understanding of the world around us, was waiting for us back at Willowbrook High. But for now, we were just two friends on a summer bike ride, blissfully unaware of the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. Sycamore Street lived up to its name, with ancient sycamore trees lining both sides of the road, their gnarled branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the cracked sidewalk. As we pedaled down the quiet street, the abandoned house loomed into view, a stark contrast to the well-maintained homes surrounding it. "There it is," Mona whispered, an unnecessary hush falling over her voice. Creepy, right? I had to admit it was unsettling. The two-story Victorian-style house might have been beautiful once, but years of neglect had turned it into something out of a horror movie. Peeling paint hung in strips from the weathered siding, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had seen better days. The front yard was a tangled mess of overgrown grass and weeds, with rusted remnants of what might have once been a child's swing set peeking out from the undergrowth. We slowed to a stop, leaning our bikes against a nearby tree. For a moment we just stood there, staring at the house in silent awe. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "what exactly is your plan here? We can't actually go inside." Mona shrugged, her eyes never leaving the house. "I don't know, I've always wondered about this place, you know? Like, what happened to the people who lived here? Why did they leave?" I had to admit I was curious too. Growing up in Willowbrook, we'd all heard the stories about the abandoned house on Sycamore Street. Some said it was haunted by the ghost of a jilted bride who had been left at the altar. Others claimed it was the site of a gruesome murder that had never been solved, but no one seemed to know the truth. "Well," I said, taking a tentative step towards the overgrown path that led to the front porch, "I guess we could take a closer look. But we're not going inside, okay?" Mona nodded eagerly, already moving ahead of me. As we approached the house, the air seemed to grow colder despite the summer heat. The porch steps creaked ominously under our weight, and I half expected them to give way entirely. "Look at this," Mona said, pointing to a series of strange symbols carved into one of the porch pillars. They looked ancient, a mix of what might have been letters and crude pictographs. "What do you think it means?" I leaned in for a closer look, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I don't know, but it's creepy as hell. Maybe we should—" My words were cut off by a sudden loud crash from inside the house. We both jumped, Mona letting out a small shriek. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Mona shook her head, her eyes wide. "I don't know, but I think we should—" This time it was her turn to be interrupted, as the front door of the house slowly creaked open. We stood frozen, unable to move as the door swung wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And then, just as suddenly as it had opened, the door slammed shut with a bang that echoed down the quiet street. We didn't need any more encouragement. In a flurry of motion, we raced back to our bikes, pedaling away from Sycamore Street as fast as our legs could carry us. It wasn't until we were several blocks away, our lungs burning and legs aching, that we finally slowed down. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. Mona shook her head, her face pale beneath her tan. "I don't know, but I don't think I want to go back there anytime soon." As we made our way back towards the center of town, neither of us spoke much. The encounter at the abandoned house had shaken us more than we wanted to admit. But little did we know, it was just the beginning of the strange events that would unfold that summer. The following days passed in a blur of normalcy, as if the universe was trying to compensate for the strangeness we'd experienced at the abandoned house. Mona and I fell back into our usual routine of bike rides and lazy afternoons in the park. but there was an undercurrent of unease that we couldn't quite shake. It was about a week after our adventure on Sycamore Street that things took another turn for the weird. We had decided to meet up for an evening ride, partly because the daytime heat had become unbearable, and partly because we were teenagers with nothing better to do. As usual, we found ourselves gravitating towards Willowbrook High. The school grounds were our favorite shortcut, a sprawling campus that connected several of the town's main roads. In the fading twilight, the red brick buildings took on an almost ethereal quality, their windows reflecting the last remnants of the setting sun. "Race you to the football field," Mona called out suddenly, already pedaling ahead. I laughed, rising to the challenge. "You're on!" We sped through the school's main courtyard, weaving between benches and planters with the ease of long practice. As we approached the sports complex, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in one of the second-floor windows of the main building. I slowed down, squinting up at the school. "Hey, Mona, did you see that?" She circled back, following my gaze. "See what?" "I could have sworn I saw someone in that window," I said, pointing. "But that's impossible, right? School's been out for weeks." Mona frowned, her earlier playfulness replaced by curiosity. "Maybe it's the custodian? Or someone from the administration getting ready for the renovations?" I shook my head. "At this hour? And why would they be on the second floor?" We both stared at the window for a long moment, but whatever I had seen didn't reappear. "Come on," Mona said finally, a hint of excitement in her voice. "Let's check it out." Before I could protest, she was already heading towards the main entrance. With a sigh, I followed, wondering not for the first time how I always let her talk me into these situations. The front doors were locked, of course, but that didn't deter Mona. She led us around to a side entrance that the sports teams often used during practices. To our surprise, and I have to admit a bit of concern, the door swung open easily. "Should we really be doing this?" I whispered as we stepped into the darkened hallway. The familiar sense of floor wax and old textbooks filled the air, but there was something else too, a heaviness that seemed to press down on us from all sides. Mona pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the way. "We're not doing anything wrong," she insisted. "We're just investigating." I wanted to point out that breaking into a school after hours probably fell under the category of wrong in most people's books, but I kept quiet. There was something about the empty school that felt off, and despite my better judgment, I wanted to know why. We made our way up to the second floor, our footsteps echoing loudly in the empty stairwell. The hallway stretched out before us, a canyon of lockers and closed classroom doors. "Which window was it?" Mona asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I pointed towards the far end of the hall. "I think it was over there, near the science labs." As we approached, a sudden chill ran through me. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I could see goosebumps rising on Mona's arms. "Do you feel that?" she asked, rubbing her arms. I nodded, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. We reached the window I had seen from outside, but there was nothing unusual about it. Just an ordinary classroom, desks neatly arranged and waiting for the start of the new school year. And then we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere down the hall. Mona and I exchanged glances, a mixture of fear and excitement passing between us. Without a word, we began to follow the sound. It led us to the old music room, a place I hadn't been since freshman year when I'd briefly, and disastrously, attempted to learn the clarinet. The door was slightly ajar, and as we approached, the tapping grew louder. Mona pushed the door open wider, her phone's flashlight illuminating the room. Rows of chairs faced a small stage, and various instruments in cases lined the walls. But what caught our attention was the grand piano in the corner. Its lid was open, and as we watched in stunned silence, the keys began to move on their own, playing a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. "Holy shit," Mona breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation for what we were seeing. A draft? Some kind of mechanical malfunction? But deep down, I knew that none of those explanations made sense. We were witnessing something truly unexplainable. The music continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The final note hung in the air, fading away into an oppressive silence. For a long moment, neither of us moved. And then, from somewhere in the depths of the school, we heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. The unmistakable echo of footsteps, growing closer. "We need to go," I said, finally finding my voice. "Now!" This time, Mona didn't argue. We turned and ran, our hearts pounding in unison with our feet as we raced down the hallway, down the stairs, and out into the warm summer night. We didn't stop running until we reached our bikes, and even then we pedaled home faster than we ever had before. As we parted ways at our usual spot, Mona turned to me, her face pale in the streetlight. "Alex," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "what just happened?" I shook my head, still trying to process everything we'd seen and heard. "I don't know, Mona, but I think our school might be haunted." As I rode home that night, the eerie melody from the piano echoing in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something much bigger and much more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. Little did I know our ghostly encounters were just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of whispered conversations and furtive glances. Mona and I tried to act normal around our families and other friends, but the weight of what we had experienced at the school hung heavy between us. We spent hours theorizing, researching local history, and debating whether or not to tell anyone what we had seen. It was Mona who finally suggested we seek out Mrs. Abernathy, the town librarian. "If anyone knows the history of this place, it's her," Mona reasoned. "Maybe she can shed some light on what's happening at the school." I had to admit, it was a good idea. Mrs. Abernathy had been the librarian at Willowbrook Public Library for as long as anyone could remember. Rumor had it that she knew every book in the place by heart and could recite the town's entire history without breaking a sweat. So, on a sweltering Thursday afternoon, we found ourselves pushing open the heavy oak doors of the Willowbrook Public Library. The cool air inside was a welcome relief from the oppressive heat, and the familiar scent of old books and furniture polish enveloped us as we entered. Mrs. Abernathy was exactly where we expected her to be, behind the main desk, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her sharp eyes peering at us over the rims of her cat-eye glasses. "Well, well," she said, her voice carrying easily in the hushed atmosphere of the library. "Alex and Mona, what brings you two in on such a lovely summer day?" Mona and I exchanged glances. We had agreed to be cautious about how much we revealed, at least at first. "We're doing some research," I said, trying to sound casual, "for a project about local history." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrow arched skeptically. "A project? In the middle of summer vacation?" Mona jumped in, always quicker on her feet than me. "We're thinking of entering the state history fair in the fall. Thought we'd get a head start." For a moment, I thought Mrs. Abernathy was going to call our bluff, but then she smiled, a glint of approval in her eyes. "Well, it's refreshing to see young people taking an interest in their heritage. What exactly are you looking for?" "We're particularly interested in the history of Willowbrook High," Mona said. "You know, any interesting stories or unusual events that might have happened there." Mrs. Abernathy's smile faded slightly, and I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something pass across her face. Concern? Fear? But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. "Willowbrook High, you say?" she mused, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "Well, I suppose every old building has its share of stories. Come with me." She led us deeper into the library, past rows of shelves, to a section I had never noticed before. A sign overhead read, "Local History and Archives." "Most of what you'll find about the school is pretty standard fare," Mrs. Abernathy said as she scanned the shelves. "Yearbooks, newspaper clippings about sports victories and academic achievements, but—" She paused, seeming to debate with herself for a moment before reaching for a dusty volume on a high shelf. "This might be of interest to you." The book she handed me was old, its leather binding cracked and faded. There was no title on the cover, just a strange symbol that looked eerily similar to the ones we had seen carved into the porch pillar of the abandoned house. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Abernathy glanced around as if making sure no one else was within earshot. "It's a journal," she said quietly, "written by Ezekiel Willowbrook, the founder of our town and the man who built what is now Willowbrook High." Mona leaned in closer, her eyes wide with excitement. "What's in it?" "That," Mrs. Abernathy said, "is something you'll have to discover for yourselves. But I will say this. Ezekiel Willowbrook was a man with unusual interests. And the school, it wasn't always a school." A chill ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the library. "What was it before?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyes met mine, and in that moment I knew she understood far more than she was letting on. "A place of secrets," she said softly. "And some secrets, once awakened, are not easily put back to rest." She straightened up suddenly, her professional demeanor snapping back into place. "Now, you two be careful with that book. It's the only copy we have. And, Alex, Mona?" We looked up at her, still reeling from the weight of what she had just shared. "Whatever you're really up to," she said, her voice low and urgent, "be careful. There are forces in this world that don't take kindly to being disturbed." With that cryptic warning, she turned and walked away, leaving us alone in the archive section with Ezekiel Willowbrook's journal and a growing sense that we had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. Mona and I found a quiet corner of the library and began to pore over the journal. The handwriting was spidery and difficult to read, and much of it was in a code or language we didn't understand. But what we could decipher sent chills down our spines. Ezekiel wrote of thin places where the veil between worlds could be pierced, of rituals performed under the light of a full moon, and of a great power he sought to harness. The school, or rather the building that would become the school, featured prominently in his writings. "Listen to this," Mona whispered, pointing to a passage near the end of the journal. "The gateway is prepared. On the night of the summer solstice, when the stars align, I shall complete the grand work. Willowbrook shall become a beacon, a bridge between realms, and I shall be its master." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. "The summer solstice," I said. "That's next week." Mona nodded, her face pale. "Alex, I think we've stumbled onto something big, something dangerous." As if in response to her words, a sudden gust of wind swept through the library, ruffling the pages of the journal and sending a cascade of whispers through the stacks. We looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between us. Our summer adventure had just taken a turn into terrifying territory, and we were in way over our heads. The next few days passed in a blur of research and increasingly bizarre occurrences. Mona and I split our time between poring over Ezekiel's journal at the library and cautiously exploring the school grounds, always on the lookout for any signs of supernatural activity. We didn't have to look far. It seemed that our initial encounters had opened a floodgate of paranormal experiences. Shadows moved where no one stood, whispers echoed in empty hallways, and more than once we caught glimpses of figures that vanished when we turned to look directly at them. But it was the dreams that really got to me. Every night since we had found the journal, I had been plagued by vivid nightmares. I dreamed of endless corridors that shifted and changed as I walked them, of a great pulsing light that called to me from the depths of the school basement, and of a shadowy figure that always seemed to be just out of sight, watching and waiting. I knew Mona was having similar dreams. I could see it in the dark circles under her eyes and the way she jumped at every unexpected noise. "We need to figure out what Ezekiel was trying to do," Mona said as we sat in my backyard, surrounded by printouts of our research and hastily scribbled notes. "And we need to stop it." I nodded, rubbing my tired eyes. "But how? We're just kids, Mona. This is big. Maybe we should tell someone, the police or—" "And tell them what?" Mona interrupted. "That we broke into the school, and now we think it's haunted because of some crazy ritual performed by the town founder 100 years ago? They'll think we're nuts." She had a point, but the weight of what we were dealing with felt crushing. "So what do we do?" Mona's eyes gleamed with determination. "We prepare. The solstice is in 3 days. Whatever Ezekiel set in motion, whatever's been waiting all this time, it's all coming to a head then. We need to be ready." And so, we prepared. We scoured the journal for any clues about how to disrupt the ritual, researched protection symbols and wards, and even convinced Mrs. Abernathy to let us borrow some books on local folklore and mysticism. As the solstice drew nearer, the atmosphere in Willowbrook grew increasingly strange. Unusual weather patterns swept through the town, one day oppressively hot, the next marked by violent thunderstorms that seemed to center around the school. People reported seeing strange lights in the sky and hearing eerie music late at night. The day before the solstice, Mona and I made one last trip to the school. We had decided to try and find the gateway Ezekiel had mentioned in his journal, hoping that if we could locate it, we might be able to prevent whatever was supposed to happen. As we approached the school, the air felt thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The school itself seemed to loom larger than ever, its windows dark and forbidding. "Ready?" Mona asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying to swallow past the lump in my throat. As I'll ever be. We made our way inside, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The school felt different now, alive somehow, as if it was aware of our presence and watching our every move. We headed for the basement, following the vague directions we had pieced together from Ezekiel's writings. The further down we went, the colder it became, until our breath fogged in front of us despite the summer heat outside. And then we found it. In the deepest part of the basement, behind a rusted door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, was a room unlike anything I had ever seen. The walls were covered in strange symbols, some carved directly into the stone, others painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. In the center of the room was a circular design on the floor, intricate patterns spiraling out from a central point. But what drew our attention was the object floating above that central point, a small glowing orb that pulsed with an inner light. "The gateway," Mona breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. As we stood there, staring at the impossible thing before us, I felt a shift in the air. The orb's pulsing quickened, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie light. And then we heard it, a voice, ancient and powerful, speaking words in a language I didn't understand, but that resonated in my very bones. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Mona's arm. "Now!" We ran, our hearts pounding, the voice growing louder behind us. We didn't stop until we were out of the school and halfway down the street. As we caught our breath, leaning against a tree, Mona turned to me, her face pale in the fading light. "Alex," she said, her voice shaking, "I think we just woke something up, something big." I nodded, unable to shake the feeling that we had just set in motion events that were far beyond our control. As the sun set on the eve of the summer solstice, Mona and I knew that tomorrow would bring either the greatest adventure of our lives or its end. The day of the summer solstice dawned bright and clear, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air that even the oblivious adults of Willowbrook couldn't ignore. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and an unseasonable chill had settled over the town. Mona and I spent the day making our final preparations. We had cobbled together a plan based on our research, a mixture of protection rituals, counterspells, and good old-fashioned improvisation. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew our chances of actually succeeding were slim at best. As evening approached, we made our way to the school. The streets were eerily empty, as if the entire town was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The school loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. As we approached, I could have sworn I saw lights flickering in the windows, despite knowing that the building should have been empty. "Last chance to back out," I said to Mona, trying to keep my voice steady. She shot me a grin, but I could see the fear behind her bravado. "Not a chance, partner. We started this. We're going to finish it." We slipped inside through the same side entrance we had used before. The hallways were dark and silent, but there was a palpable energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that made my skin crawl. We made our way down to the basement, our flashlights casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The closer we got to the ritual room, the more intense the energy became. By the time we reached the rusted door, it felt like the very air was vibrating. Taking a deep breath, we pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room had changed since we had last seen it. The symbols on the walls were glowing brightly now, pulsing in a hypnotic rhythm. The orb in the center of the room had grown larger, its light almost blinding. And we weren't alone. Standing around the edge of the circular design on the floor were shadowy figures, translucent ghostly forms that flickered in and out of visibility. And at the head of the circle, directly opposite us, stood a more solid figure, a man in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Ezekiel Willowbrook," Mona whispered beside me. The figure turned towards us, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force. "Ah," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "The meddlers arrive, come to witness the culmination of my life's work?" I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "We've come to stop you," I said, proud that my voice only shook a little. Ezekiel laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Stop me? You're 100 years too late for that, child. The gateway is opening. The power I have sought for so long is finally within my grasp." As if in response to his words, the orb pulsed brightly, and I felt a wave of energy wash over me. The ghostly figures around the circle began to chant, their voices blending into a single otherworldly tone. Mona and I exchanged glances. This was it, the moment we had prepared for. Without a word, we sprang into action. Mona began to recite the counterspell we had pieced together from Ezekiel's journal and the books we had borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy. I focused on creating a protective circle around us, using the chalk and herbs we had brought. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The ghostly chanting faltered, and the light of the orb dimmed slightly. But then Ezekiel raised his hands, and the energy in the room intensified. The orb grew brighter, expanding until it was almost as large as the circle on the floor. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Ezekiel intoned. "The gateway will open, and the power of the beyond will be mine to command." The orb pulsed one final time, and then it shattered. Light exploded outward, blinding in its intensity. I felt a rush of wind, and then a sensation like I was being pulled in 1,000 directions at once. When my vision cleared, I gasped in shock. The room, no, the entire world around us had changed. We were standing in a place that defied description, a swirling vortex of colors and shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And through it all, I could see things. creatures and entities beyond my comprehension, pressing against the fabric of reality, trying to break through. Ezekiel stood in the center of it all, his arms raised triumphantly. "At last!" he cried, his voice booming impossibly loud. "The power of the universe is mine to command!" But something was wrong. Even as Ezekiel reveled in his victory, I could see the strain on his face. The energies he had unleashed were too much, too wild to control. "Mona!" I shouted over the cacophony of otherworldly sounds. "We need to close it! We need to seal the gateway!" She nodded, her face set in determination. Together we began to chant, drawing on every scrap of knowledge we had gleaned from our research. Ezekiel turned towards us, his face contorted in rage. "No! You will not deny me my destiny!" He lashed out with a wave of energy that sent us stumbling backwards. But we didn't stop chanting. I could feel something building, a power that came not from the swirling chaos around us, but from within. And then, just when I thought we couldn't hold on any longer, something shifted. The swirling vortex began to contract, the otherworldly entities retreating. Ezekiel screamed in frustration and fear. "No! No, I won't go back, I won't!" His words were cut off as the vortex collapsed in on itself, pulling him along with it. For a moment I saw his face clearly, no longer the powerful sorcerer, but a man consumed by fear and regret. And then he was gone, swallowed up by the closing gateway. The room spun around us, reality reasserting itself with a violent shudder. Mona and I were thrown to the ground as the last of the otherworldly energies dissipated. For a long moment we just lay there, gasping for breath. The basement was dark and silent, the glowing symbols on the walls now nothing more than faded paint and shallow carvings. Did we do it?" Mona asked, her voice hoarse. I pushed myself up, looking around the room. The circular design on the floor was scorched and blackened, and the air smelled of ozone and something else, something alien, but the oppressive energy that had filled the room was gone. "I think so," I said, hardly daring to believe it. "I think we actually did it." Mona let out a shaky laugh, which quickly turned into a sob. I crawled over to her and we held each other, the weight of what we had just experienced crashing down on us. We must have fallen asleep there on the basement floor, exhausted beyond measure. When we woke, pale morning light was filtering through the small, grimy windows near the ceiling. Slowly, carefully, we made our way out of the basement and up through the school. Everything looked normal, almost jarringly so after what we had seen the night before. As we stepped out into the bright summer morning, we were met with a sight that made us stop in our tracks. The entire town seemed to be gathered in front of the school, a mix of concerned parents, curious onlookers, and stern-faced police officers. And there, standing at the front of the crowd, was Mrs. Abernathy. She looked at us, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and... was that pride? "Alex, Mona," she said, her voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. "I think you two have some explaining to do." The next few hours were a blur of questions, concerned adults, and hastily concocted explanations. We couldn't exactly tell the truth. Who would believe us? So we spun a tale of getting locked in the school while exploring, embellishing it with just enough truth to make it believable. Most of the adults seemed to buy it, chalking up the town's strange experiences to an unusually strong summer storm and overactive imaginations. But Mrs. Abernathy knew better. As the crowd began to disperse and our parents fussed over us, she pulled us aside. "You did it, didn't you?" she said quietly. "You closed the gateway." Mona and I exchanged glances. There was no point in denying it to her. "How did you know?" I asked. Mrs. Abernathy smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Let's just say you're not the first young people in this town to stumble upon Ezekiel's secrets, but you might be the first to actually set things right." She reached into her bag and pulled out a familiar leather-bound book, Ezekiel's journal. I think it's time this was put somewhere safe, somewhere it won't cause any more trouble. As she turned to leave, Mona called out, "Mrs. Abernathy? What happens now?" The librarian looked back at us, her expression softening. Now? Now you live, Alex and Mona. You face something few people ever will, and you've come out the other side. That's not something to take lightly. She paused, considering her next words carefully. The world is stranger and more wonderful than most people ever realize. You've been given a glimpse behind the curtain. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. With that, she walked away, leaving us to ponder her words. The rest of the summer passed in a haze of normalcy that felt almost surreal after what we had experienced. Mona and I spent a lot of time talking, trying to process everything that had happened. We made a pact to keep the full truth to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? But we also promised to always be there for each other, no matter what strange things the future might hold. As the days grew shorter and the start of school approached, life in Willowbrook settled back into its usual rhythms. But for Mona and I, things would never be quite the same. We had seen behind the veil, glimpsed the extraordinary hiding just beneath the surface of the ordinary. And as we walked into Willowbrook High on the first day of our senior year, we shared a secret smile. The school halls might look the same, but we knew the truth. We had faced the unknown and come out stronger. Whatever challenges this year might bring, we were ready. After all, once you've saved your town from an interdimensional invasion, what's a little high school drama? Years have passed since that fateful summer, and Mona and I have long since graduated from Willowbrook High. Life has taken us in different directions: college, careers, new cities. But we've always stayed in touch, bound by the secret we shared. I find myself back in Willowbrook now, visiting family for the holidays. The town looks much the same as it always has, twinkling Christmas lights adding a festive glow to the familiar streets. On a whim, I decide to take a walk past the old high school. As I approach, I feel a familiar tingle of energy, like static electricity in the air. For a moment, I swear I see a flicker of movement in one of the second-floor windows, a shadow passing by, or perhaps just a trick of the light. I smile to myself, remembering Mrs. Abernathy's words from all those years ago. The world is indeed stranger and more wonderful than most people ever realize. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or perhaps very unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of the extraordinary hiding in plain sight. As I turn to head home, I pull out my phone and send a quick text to Mona. "Merry Christmas. The veil's looking a little thin tonight. Want to grab coffee tomorrow and reminisce about old times?" Her reply comes almost instantly. "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Some adventures are too good to forget." I chuckle, pocketing my phone and casting one last glance at the school. In the gathering dusk, it almost seems to wink at me, a silent acknowledgement of shared secrets. Whatever the future holds, I know one thing for certain. Life is never boring when you've peeked behind the curtain of reality. And who knows? Maybe Mona and I have one more adventure left in us yet. After all, in a town like Willowbrook, anything is possible. I never believed in the paranormal. For as long as I can remember, I've been the type of person who needs concrete evidence to believe in something. Whenever friends would drag me to supposedly haunted places, I'd roll my eyes internally, knowing that nothing would happen. I was the ultimate skeptic, always ready with a logical explanation for any seemingly supernatural occurrence. Growing up in a small town in the Midwest, I was surrounded by local legends and ghost stories. Our town had its fair share of allegedly haunted houses and spooky graveyards, but I never bought into any of it. I remember countless sleepovers where my friends would try to scare each other with tales of restless spirits and vengeful ghosts. While they huddled together in fear, I'd sit there amused by their gullibility. Even as a child, I was drawn to science and reason. I devoured books on physics, astronomy, and biology, always seeking to understand the world through a rational lens. My parents encouraged this curiosity, filling our home with encyclopedias and scientific journals. They taught me to question everything and never accept something as true without evidence. This skepticism followed me into adulthood. I pursued a degree in computer science, finding comfort in the logical world of algorithms and data structures. The binary nature of coding appealed to me. Things either worked or they didn't, with no room for supernatural explanations. My friends often joked that I was the person they'd least expect to see in a horror movie. "You'd be the one telling the ghost to follow proper haunting protocols," they'd laugh. And they weren't wrong. I prided myself on being the voice of reason, always ready to debunk any paranormal claim with cold, hard facts. Little did I know that my entire worldview was about to be shattered. It was October 2022 when my life took an unexpected turn. I had just started a new job at a tech startup in the city, and one of my coworkers invited me to a Halloween party. Normally, I wasn't one for costume parties, but I decided to go, figuring it would be a good way to bond with my new colleagues. The party was held in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. As I walked up the creaky steps to the front door, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony of a skeptic like myself attending a Halloween party in such a stereotypically haunted location. That's when I met Zach. He was dressed as a Victorian-era ghost hunter, complete with an antique-looking EMF meter and a leather-bound journal. I was immediately drawn to his warm smile and the mischievous glint in his eyes. We started talking, and I was surprised to find myself enjoying our conversation immensely. Zach was different from anyone I'd ever met. He had a way of looking at the world that was both analytical and open-minded. As we chatted, I learned that he worked as a historian, specializing in folklore and urban legends. Despite my skepticism about his field of study, I found myself fascinated by his stories and the passion with which he told them. As the night wore on, we found ourselves sitting on the back porch, away from the noise of the party. The cool October air nipped at our skin, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over the overgrown garden. It was there, under the starry sky, that Zach first told me about his experiences with the paranormal. "I've been sensitive to it since I was a toddler," he said, his voice low and serious. "I've seen things that most people wouldn't believe." I listened, trying to keep an open mind despite my ingrained skepticism. Zach told me about seeing his dead grandfather standing at the foot of his bed when he was 5 years old. He described hearing whispers and footsteps in empty rooms and feeling an unseen presence watching him. But the worst, he said, his eyes distant, was the demon. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite myself. "A demon?" Zach nodded solemnly. "Moloch." The name sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Zach went on to explain the lore behind Moloch, an ancient deity associated with child sacrifice, often referred to as the child eater in various mythologies. "When I was a child," Zach continued, "Moloch tormented me. It was so bad that my grandfather had to get a priest to bless the house." I wanted to dismiss his story as an overactive childhood imagination, but something in Zach's eyes made me pause. There was a vulnerability there, a hint of residual fear that seemed too real to be fabricated. As the party wound down and we said our goodbyes, I found myself thinking about Zach's stories. Despite my skepticism, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. Zach and I started dating soon after that Halloween party. Our relationship blossomed quickly, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine connection. Despite our differing views on the paranormal, we found common ground in our love for knowledge and our desire to understand the world around us. For the first few months, everything was perfect. We'd spend our weekends exploring museums, going on hikes, or simply curled up on the couch watching documentaries. Zach's passion for history complemented my love for technology, and we'd often have long, engaging discussions that would last well into the night. It wasn't until about 6 months into our relationship that things started to change. At first it was subtle. I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling uneasy for no apparent reason. The air in my apartment would feel heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing down on my chest. I'd shake it off, attributing it to stress from work, or perhaps some subconscious anxiety about my relationship. But then, things started happening that were harder to explain away. One evening, as Zach and I were cooking dinner together, a glass suddenly flew off the counter and shattered against the far wall. We both stood there, stunned, staring at the shards of glass scattered across the kitchen floor. "Did you see that?" Zach asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was a tremor, or the counter could be slightly sloped. Zach gave me a look that was equal parts concern and pity. "You know that's not what happened," he said gently. I wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be a rational explanation, but the words died in my throat. Deep down, I knew that what I'd seen defied conventional logic. From that day on, strange occurrences became more frequent. Books would fall off shelves for no reason. We'd hear whispers in empty rooms, too faint to make out the words but undeniably present. The temperature in certain areas of my apartment would drop suddenly, creating pockets of icy cold air in the middle of summer. Zach seemed to take it all in stride, almost as if he'd been expecting it. But for me, it was a constant battle between what I was experiencing and what I had always believed to be true. One night, about 8 months into our relationship, I woke up to find Zach sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide with fear. "He's back," Zach whispered, his voice trembling. "Moloch. He's found me again." I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was just a nightmare, but the words wouldn't come, because at that moment I saw it too, a dark, hulking shape at the foot of our bed, its eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. In that instant, my world shifted. Everything I thought I knew about reality crumbled away, leaving me face to face with a truth I had spent my entire life denying. The paranormal was real, and it had just invaded my life in the most terrifying way possible. As the days turned into weeks, the paranormal activity in our lives intensified. What had started as occasional, easily dismissible incidents now became a near constant assault on our senses and our sanity. The presence of Moloch grew stronger, more oppressive. We'd wake up to find strange symbols scratched into the walls, symbols that Zach identified as ancient Canaanite script associated with child sacrifice. The air in our apartment always felt thick, as if we were breathing in something more than just oxygen, something dark and malevolent. One morning I woke up to find bruises on my arms and legs, as if I'd been grabbed by strong, unseen hands. Zach had scratch marks down his back, angry red lines that couldn't have been self-inflicted. "This is how it started when I was a kid," Zach said, his voice hollow as he examined the marks in the bathroom mirror. "It's only going to get worse." I wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be a rational explanation, but I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes anymore. The skeptic in me was dying a slow, painful death, replaced by a growing sense of terror and helplessness. We tried everything we could think of to rid ourselves of the malevolent presence. We burned sage, hung protective charms, even had a local priest come to bless the apartment. Nothing seemed to work. If anything, our efforts only seemed to anger the entity, making its attacks more frequent and more violent. The worst part was the isolation. We couldn't tell anyone what was happening to us. I tried talking to my mom once, explaining the strange occurrences and the growing sense of dread that permeated our lives. She just looked at me with a mixture of concern, and disbelief. "Honey," she said, patting my hand, "I believe that you believe this is happening, but don't you think it's more likely that you're just under a lot of stress?" Her words stung more than she could know. I had always prided myself on my rationality, on my ability to see through superstition and myth. Now here I was, trying to convince others of the very things I had once dismissed as fantasy. Zach and I withdrew from our friends and family, unable to share the terror that had become our daily reality. We clung to each other, finding solace in the fact that at least we weren't going through this nightmare alone. But even that solace was threatened by Moloch's growing influence. There were moments when I'd look at Zach and see something else looking back at me through his eyes, something ancient and evil. In those moments, I'd wonder if I was truly safe with him, or if Moloch's connection to Zach put me in even greater danger. As our second anniversary approached, the activity reached a fever pitch. Objects would fly across the room with enough force to embed themselves in the walls. We'd hear children crying in the night, their wails filled with terror and pain. The woman in white that we'd occasionally glimpse now appeared almost nightly, her face a mask of sorrow and warning. I started waking up every night between midnight and 4 a.m., pulled from sleep by a sense of overwhelming dread. Each time I'd witness something so horrifying that it would leave me shaken for days. One night I woke to find myself unable to move, paralyzed in my bed. I could only watch in silent terror as a dark shape materialized at the foot of the bed. It leaned over me, its face a shifting mass of shadows, and I felt something cold and sharp tracing patterns on my skin. When I was finally able to move, I rushed to the bathroom to find strange symbols branded into my flesh. The letter M, my name, the number 13, and the word IT. There was also a triangle shape, its significance unknown but somehow terrifying. I showed Zach, my hand shaking as I pointed out each mark. His face went pale, and for the first time since this all began, I saw real fear in his eyes. "He's marking you," Zach whispered. "Moloch is claiming you as his." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about tormenting us anymore. Moloch wanted something from me, something I couldn't begin to understand. As I stood there examining the brands on my skin, I realized that we had crossed a line. This was no longer just a haunting. It was a battle for our very souls, and I had no idea how to fight back. It was the night before our second anniversary when I had the dream. A dream so vivid, so terrifying, that it felt more real than reality itself. In the dream, I found myself in a vast, dark chamber. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, slick with some unknown substance that glistened in the dim light. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something metallic, blood, I realized with a surge of horror. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw that I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved around the edges of the chamber, their forms indistinct but unmistakably inhuman. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark with centuries of unspeakable rituals. And there, looming over the altar, was Moloch. He was nothing like I had imagined. Not the stereotypical demon with horns and a pitchfork, but something far more ancient and terrible. His body was a twisted amalgamation of man and beast, with limbs that bent at impossible angles and skin that seemed to writhe with a life of its own. His face was a void, a black hole that seemed to draw in all light and hope. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare, but I was frozen in place, unable to do anything but watch as Moloch turned his attention to me. When he spoke, his voice was like the grinding of tectonic plates, ancient and implacable. "You have been chosen," he said, the words reverberating through my very being. I found my voice, small and trembling. "Chosen for what?" Moloch's face split in a grin that was all teeth and darkness. "To bear my child." The horror of his words crashed over me like a tidal wave. I wanted to protest, to fight back, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch in mute terror as Moloch approached, his form shifting and changing with each step. What happened next was a violation so profound, so utterly horrifying, that my mind has mercifully blocked out most of the details. I remember pain and a cold so intense it burned. I remember the sensation of something alien and wrong trying to take root inside me. And I remember screaming, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to go on forever. When I finally woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my throat raw as if I had been screaming in reality as well as in the dream. Zach was there holding me, his face a mask of concern and fear. "You were thrashing around," he said, his voice shaking. "I couldn't wake you up. What happened?" I tried to speak, to tell him about the dream, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I broke down in his arms, sobbing uncontrollably as the horror of what I had experienced washed over me again and again. It wasn't until hours later, as the first light of dawn was breaking through our windows, that I was able to tell Zach about the dream. As I spoke, I saw the color drain from his face. "This is worse than I thought," he said when I had finished. "Moloch isn't just tormenting us anymore. He's chosen you for something." "But why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" Zach shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know. But we need to find out, and we need to stop him before—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. As we sat there, holding each other in the growing light of day, I realized that our lives had irrevocably changed. We were no longer just victims of a haunting. We were now players in a cosmic game whose rules we didn't understand. And the stakes, I feared, were higher than we could possibly imagine. In the days following my terrifying dream, Zach and I threw ourselves into research, desperate to understand what was happening to us and how we could fight back against Moloch. We scoured ancient texts, consulted with experts in demonology, always under the guise of historical research, and even reached out to some of Zach's more eccentric colleagues in the paranormal investigation community. What we learned was both fascinating and terrifying. Moloch, it turned out, was far more than just a demon. In ancient Canaanite religion, he was a deity associated with child sacrifice. His worship was condemned in the Old Testament, but traces of his cult persisted throughout history, always lurking in the shadows of civilization. One of Zach's colleagues, a reclusive expert in ancient Near Eastern religions, provided us with a chilling theory. "Moloch isn't just after torment or fear," she explained during a late-night video call, her face illuminated by flickering candlelight. "He feeds on innocence, on potential. That's why child sacrifice was so integral to his worship. But in the modern world, where such practices are thankfully rare, he's had to adapt." "Adapt how?" I asked, dreading the answer. The scholar's eyes met mine through the screen, her gaze intense. "He's looking for a vessel, someone to bear his child into the world. A child that would embody both human potential and demonic power." The words hit me like a physical blow, confirming my worst fears about the dream I'd had. Zach grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. "How do we stop him?" Zach demanded. The scholar sighed heavily. "It won't be easy. Moloch is ancient and powerful, but he's not invincible. The key is to sever his connection to our world." She went on to explain a ritual that could potentially banish Moloch back to whatever hellish realm he came from. It would require rare ingredients, precise timing, and most importantly, an unwavering will to resist Moloch's influence. As we ended the call, I felt a mix of hope and dread. We had a plan now, a way to fight back. But the road ahead was fraught with danger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Moloch was always one step ahead of us. The next few weeks were a blur of frantic preparation. We gathered the ingredients for the ritual rare herbs, blessed objects, and a few items I'd rather not mention. Each component seemed to come with its own set of challenges and close calls. One particularly harrowing experience occurred when we were trying to obtain a specific type of consecrated salt. We had to visit an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. As we entered the crumbling building, the temperature dropped dramatically, and I could have sworn I heard children's voices whispering in the shadows. Zach and I split up to search for the salt, which was supposedly hidden in the church's crypt. As I descended the narrow stone stairs into the darkness below, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but there was nothing there. Just as I located the salt, stored in an ancient-looking wooden box, I heard Zach's voice calling out in panic from above. I rushed back up the stairs to find him standing in the nave, his face pale with shock. "I saw her," he gasped. "The woman in white. She was right there, pointing at the altar." We hurried to the altar, and there, carved into the aged wood, was a fresh message. "Beware the 13th." The incident left us shaken, but more determined than ever to see our plan through. We knew we were on the right track if Moloch was trying to scare us off. As the days passed, the paranormal activity in our lives intensified. Objects would move on their own more frequently, often forming unsettling patterns or symbols. The bruises and scratches on our bodies became more numerous and severe, and always there was the sense of being watched, of a malevolent presence lurking just out of sight. I started keeping a detailed journal of everything that happened, partly to maintain my sanity, and partly in the hope that if something happened to us, someone might find it and understand what we'd been through. The strain began to take its toll on our relationship. There were moments when I'd look at Zach and see a stranger, his eyes distant and cold, and I knew he sometimes saw the same in me. We were both changing, hardened by our experiences and the constant fear we lived with. But through it all, we clung to each other and to the hope that we could put an end to this nightmare. Finally, the day of the ritual arrived. It was, fittingly, Friday the 13th, the day the woman in white had warned us about. We had chosen to perform the ritual in the same abandoned church where we'd found the salt, hoping that the lingering sanctity of the place would give us an edge. As night fell, we began our preparations. We drew protective circles, lit candles, and laid out our carefully gathered components. The air was thick with tension and the scent of burning herbs. Just as we were about to begin, a cold wind swept through the church, extinguishing half our candles. In the sudden dimness, I saw a familiar shape forming in the shadows, the hulking, twisted form of Moloch. "You cannot stop what has already begun," his voice rumbled, shaking dust from the rafters. Zach and I exchanged a determined look. This was it, our last chance to end this. We began the ritual, our voices rising in an ancient chant. As we spoke the words, the air around us seemed to thicken, becoming almost solid. Moloch roared in fury, the sound shaking the very foundations of the church. Objects began to fly around the room, hurled by an unseen force. I felt invisible hands clawing at me, trying to break my concentration. But we pressed on, our voices growing stronger as we neared the climax of the ritual. Suddenly Zach stumbled, his voice faltering. I saw his eyes glaze over, turning black as night. When he spoke again, it was with Moloch's voice. "You are mine," he growled, reaching for me with hands that seemed to elongate into claws. In that moment, I felt a surge of strength from deep within. I completed the ritual alone, my voice ringing out clear and strong in the chaos around us. There was a blinding flash of light, a sound like reality itself tearing apart, and then silence. When my vision cleared, I saw Zach lying unconscious on the floor. Of Moloch there was no sign. Had we done it? Had we actually banished the demon? As I helped Zach to his feet, I realized that the oppressive presence we'd lived with for so long was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. We stumbled out of the church into the cool night air, exhausted but triumphant. For the first time in months, I felt hope for our future. It's been a year since that night in the church. Zach and I are still together, our bond stronger for having faced such horrors side by side. The paranormal activity that had dominated our lives has ceased entirely, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I still wake up with a start, my heart racing. I see shadows move in ways they shouldn't, or hear whispers just at the edge of hearing, and I wonder, did we really defeat Moloch? Or is he just biding his time, waiting for the right moment to return? I keep my journal close, documenting every unexplained occurrence, every uneasy feeling. Because if Moloch does return, I want to be ready. And I want others to know the truth about what lurks in the shadows of our world. To anyone reading this, remain skeptical, but keep an open mind. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, and sometimes the difference between fantasy and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. Stay vigilant. Stay strong. And if you ever hear whispers in the night or see shadows move when they shouldn't, run.